was born in 1941 in St. Louis, Missouri. He pursued graduate studies in Christian theology at Kennewick Theological Seminary. In 1967, he was ordained a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Father Michel entered the Society of Jesus in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, in 1969 and became a member of the Indonesian province of the Jesuits. He studied Arabic and Islamic thought at the Middle East Center in Lebanon from 1971 to 72, and then at the American University of Cairo from 1973 to 74. He completed his PhD studies at the University of Chicago in 1978 under the guidance of Professor Fazlur Rahman, some of you probably remember him, with a dissertation on the 14th century Muslim thinker Ibn Taymiyyah, which was subsequently published as a Muslim theologian's response to Christianity, Ibn Taymiyyah's Al-Jarab al-Sahih. There's a rather long list of publications of Father Michel. I will mention briefly three. A book that Father Michel published with Michael Fitzgerald, Recognize the Spiritual Bonds Which Unite Us, 16 Years of Christian-Muslim Dialogue. That was in 1994. Another book that he published in 1997, A Christian Looks at Islamic Spirituality, published in the Philippines. And finally, in 2003, a book titled What Muslims Should Know About Christianity. And that was published in Nairobi, Kenya. He's the author of over 11 books and numerous articles published in journals and as chapters in books. Father Michel has been involved in interreligious dialogue throughout the course of his professional career. Being a Jesuit, living in a Muslim-majority Indonesia, and studying Islam facilitated the need for raising questions that went beyond a single faith. In 1981, he was appointed to the Asia desk of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, and later became the head of the Office for Islam in the same Vatican department. Father Michel also served as the Executive Secretary for the Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, which is based in Thailand from 1994 to 1996. Until recently, he was Secretary for Interreligious Dialogue of the Society of Jesus. Father Michel has taught at a number of educational institutions around the world, in the United States, Northwestern, Columbia, Georgetown, John Carroll, and currently at Marquette. But around the world, in Indonesia, I'm not going to give you all the names of the universities because that will take me half hour. In Indonesia, in Turkey, in the Philippines, in Italy, in Malaysia, in Albania, and in the United Kingdom, just to name a few. Father Michel is also a member of the Academic Council of the Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. He's also a senior fellow at the same center. And at the same time, he's a research fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center, located also on the campus of Georgetown University. He's a member of a number of advisory and educational editorial boards. And again, I'm going to spare you the names. Notably, the prestigious Khalidi Library in Jerusalem, the International Movement for a Just World Trust in Kuala Lumpur, and the Center for Civilizational Dialogue at the University of Malaya, also in Kuala Lumpur. In 2000, Father Michel delivered the prestigious Darcy Lectures on theological topics related to Christian-Muslim studies at Oxford University. Father Michel has given numerous lectures and presentations on themes ranging from Christian-Muslim relations to to ecumenism and on grassroots empowerment, addressing scholars, students, diplomats, and political leaders, and a whole host of groups working for justice and peace in their local communities. In the fall of, and I'm jumping a whole decade here, in the fall of 2011, Father Michel was a visiting professor at John Carroll University, and currently he is the holder of Reverend Francis Wade S.J. Chair at Marquette University in Milwaukee. In a book of essays by Father Michel, which I recently edited, some of you may have seen this, I noted that Father Michel belongs to a community of witness, a term which I borrowed from Professor Tariq Khalidi, who published a very nice little book called Muslim Jesus, where I understood the term to mean a community whose members strive to live the traditions to which they belong. And yet they may appear larger than that tradition. A community where people from different religions can both be authentic selves in the sense of the Christian self and Muslim self, and at the same time be able to identify with the other in ways that defies traditional relationships across confessional boundaries. It is a view where the other is no longer an adversary, rather an indispensable partner in a journey towards God. And we can spend a fortnight on that topic, so I'm going to skip that. So why is Father Michel, in my view at least, and in the view of many, a member of this community of witness? And I'll come to that in a minute. Let me say, I mentioned that he's at Marquette currently. He gave this prestigious lecture 2 weeks ago. The title of the talk was "The Catholic Priest Among Muslims, What I Have Learned." Afterwards, I heard from many of my students and faculty colleagues, and none of their responses really surprised me, but I thought they were worth repeating. One colleague said, "I struggled to contain my tears as I was listening to Father Michel." Another mentioned that she had never heard a talk like this before at an academic institution. And just 2 days ago, I ran into Father Bob Wiles, who is the former president of Marquette University, who said to me, "I regret missing his lecture because at the Jesuit residence, all the Jesuits are raving about it." I believe these responses are a testament to the fact which many of us already know. Father Michel's authority comes not only from textual and scholarly references, but more importantly from his own rich tapestry of experiences. His sources are often the countless people he met during his travels and dialogue encounters. His language is the language of the heart, responding to the kind acts of strangers and reporting on the unique and equally important ways of life beyond. And his approach is that of witness, in the sense that it demands, as I said, that we strive or do jihad to practice what we say our religions teach us in every encounter, in every situation, and even when we don't feel like doing it. As Father Michel himself noted in his writings, quote, "Affirmations alone are not enough to build a culture of dialogue and mutual respect," end quote. As many of you know, he's been claimed as one of our own by so many communities around the world. So I asked this question, what is his secret? Why is he sought out by so many people? And I came to this conclusion that besides his own personal charm, which itself is enough, I think his secret is that he embodies an ethic which, much like our human DNA, is identical in its essence in the great religious traditions of the world. The core values that he professes and practices are identifiable, recognizable to a Hindu, to a Jew, to a Muslim, and so forth. A generation of Christians and Muslims, scholars and practitioners alike, have come to learn from Father Michel. Christian-Muslim dialogue has come of age, thanks to the efforts of people like him. It is quite fitting then that the present event offers a perfect opportunity to honor Father Michel and celebrate his work of the last 4 decades and more. Please join me in welcoming Father Thomas Michel.
Well, that was really a beautiful introduction. I don't know how anything I say is going to be able to live up to that. The plenary theme that we have this year is Living Our Faith Together. Now, this was the original title that I received and the one that, according to which I prepared my talk. But later on, in one of the schedules, including the schedule we have in our bulletin, I saw a variation, Living Our Faiths Together. Well, I'm not sure which was the intended title and which was the typo, but I do like the original text, Living Our Faith Together. I think it's the mark of the maturity of the 3 national Muslim Catholic dialogues that have been held over the last 16 years, that we recognize our common commitment as Muslims and Christians to respond to the one God with the same sense of obedience, submission, worship, and trust that characterized the faith of Abraham. It's therefore proper that we look to Abraham as our common father in faith, and that we come together to celebrate living our faith together. In this context, I recall the words of John Paul II, you know, that out of the biography that Irfan read. One of the really neat moments in my life was being able to work in the Vatican for 13 years as the representative of the Pope for relations with Muslims, working for Pope John Paul, who really loved Muslims. And he met with Muslims more than all other popes in history put together, and really encouraged any kind of initiatives we wanted to make. And so to be part of that was really one of the good memories that I have in my life. Well, in 1982, the Pope met the Muslims in Otranto, in Italy. And there he noted that Islamic faith in God that Muslims have inherited from Abraham, he says, forms a deep basis for the spiritual unity with Christians and a foundation for dialogue that should transcend historical and theological differences. And here I quote him. He says, "We present to the one God the challenge of coming closer and having true dialogue with those who are united to us, despite the differences, by faith in the one and only God, a faith inherited from Abraham." Notice that the Pope refers to Muslims as those who are united to us by faith, despite the differences. He is referring to an already existing spiritual bond rooted in the faith. This reminds me of what Bishop Madden was talking about this morning. An already existing spiritual bond rooted in the faith which Christians and Muslims can trace back to Abraham. The challenge, as the Pope sees it, is not that of creating some vague spiritual unity or theoretical fellowship, but rather he's urging Christians to come closer, he says, to deepen through dialogue a faith-based fellowship with a community of believers with whom we are already united by a common submission to the one God. The challenge is to realize the unity that is already there in the personal and communitarian ways that we relate to one another. So, how do we live our Abrahamic faith together? It's basically by responding to God and acting toward one another today with the values we find exemplified by Abraham in our respective scriptures. This is not something we need a degree in theology to understand or express. Every pious Muslim and Christian is called to live his and her faith in their daily encounters, both with brothers and sisters of their own community and with those outside their own community. We're not talking about finding some common denominator, of shaving off the specifics of Islamic faith and Christian faith to arrive at something acceptable to both. No, what we're doing is striving to recognize that in living faithfully before God, in the full specificity of what is involved in being faithful Muslims and faithful Catholics, there is nevertheless much that we share. One of the first lessons that we learn from Abraham in the context of our pluralist societies is living one's faith transcends some minimalist view that claims that we have no obligations owed to anyone outside our circles of family or religious confession. Does God care how we treat someone outside the family, outside my religious group? Both the Quran and the Bible teach us that one of Abraham's key virtues is hospitality. Both religions teach that hospitality should be our special concern. In short, the Abrahamic virtue of hospitality is a clear message from God that our responsibilities are not limited to our own family and people, but extend as well to those outside our immediate circle. But what does that mean in actual practice? Let me give an example from my own experience. I recall a day 30 years ago. I was a student doing Arabic studies in Cairo, in Egypt. Well, one afternoon during Ramadan, I took a walk through the streets of the old neighborhood of Cairo, not far from Al-Azhar and Hussein mosques. It was almost sunset, and the usually busy streets of Cairo were quiet, with families gathered at home to break the fast together. I could only see a few cars and taxis hurrying home to be in time to break the fast. Well, as I was enjoying the unusually quiet atmosphere of the city and watching the sun inch slowly towards the western horizon, I was just sort of walking along, enjoying the moment. This man came running out of a house, and he grabbed me by the arm, and he started dragging me into his house. And I looked at it, and I said, excuse me, and he says, hurry, it's almost time for iftar. And he thought that I was a Muslim who had no place to break the fast. So I said, but I'm a Christian. He said, Malesh. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, it's a blessing for us Muslims to have a guest for iftar. So after a little more persuading, I went into the house and met his wife and his 5 children, and we had good food and conversation and the joy of what you might call table fellowship. Well, think about that. It's a blessing from God to have a guest. through the hospitality of this simple man, I found out later that his name was Farouk, and he was a barber. I not only learned something about the graces, the blessings that God grants to Muslims who piously perform their Ramadan fast, but I discovered something as well about the significance of welcoming a visitor, of the beauty of gratuitous acceptance and love for the stranger, of the way the dignity of both host and guest is raised up before God in the exercise of open-heartedly receiving a guest. From Farouk and his family, I came to understand something about Islam that I couldn't have learned from books. That is, what Abrahamic hospitality is really like when it is practiced in modern life, and the way that God wants us to accept the stranger in our midst. Now, Pope John Paul II, he averted to the same reality when he affirmed that the spiritual unity of the children of Abraham can be found in living the genuine tradition of our Abrahamic faith. You might remember when he arrived in Pakistan in 1981, he was received by the country's president, Zia al-Haq. The Pope addressed President Zia as follows. He said, one of the outstanding characteristics of Abraham, to whose faith Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike eagerly linked their own, was his great spirit of hospitality, shown when he welcomed the guests at the Oak of Mamre. In 1985, 4 years later, speaking to the Muslims of Morocco, he reiterated the message. He said, as Christians and Muslims, we have many things in common, as believers and as human beings. For us, Abraham is our very model of faith in God, of submission to his will, and of confidence in his goodness. Now, one reason why it is important that we focus on the essential qualities of the faith that we inherit from Abraham is because we live at a time when the values of that common faith are tried and tested in many ways. In some Muslim-majority countries, Christians feel that their civil and religious liberties are not respected. They are prevented from building places of worship, experience discrimination, finding jobs and housing. But Muslims fare no better in many Western countries. In our own nation, during the recent month of Ramadan, no less than 10 mosques and Islamic centers were defaced, desecrated, or burned to the ground. Others encountered legal challenges and popular resistance. Very recently, Muslim commuters taking the train to work in the morning in New York have had to face billboard advertisements that refer to them as savages and that distort their religious beliefs. I have to confess, I've lived for many years in Muslim-majority countries, but have never been forced to endure that kind of blatant and public aspersions on my faith. So to me, it's obvious that the key Abrahamic virtue of hospitality is still much needed in our society. We have to see this virtue not as a quaint and sentimental relic of the way people used to live in the olden days, but rather as a basic attitude toward the neighbor that is much needed in our societies today. When any religious group is attacked or defamed or insulted, all of us who claim to be children of Abraham must respond in solidarity. We do this through common statements of support, advocating for legal and civil protection for vulnerable groups, and most of all, I think, by educating our people in the importance of tolerance, respect, and esteem for one another. In this way, we renew Abraham's example of hospitality and make it into a crucial strategy for building pluralist societies in the 21st century. Those who are called to be teachers in their community have a responsibility to form their people in the knowledge that hatred or disparagement of any group on religious, ethnic, or racial grounds is not only socially unacceptable, it is a sin against the God who loves and made us all. When was the last time we heard a Friday or a Sunday sermon that stated that hate talk and disrespect for others' faith and discrimination in society is a sin that demands repentance and asking forgiveness from God? It is sacrilegious to claim to be proclaiming Christ by burning a Quran or making a hate-filled video about Muslims. Similarly, it's sacrilegious to claim to be defending the Prophet Muhammad by killing innocent persons when the Quran clearly teaches that to kill someone wrongly, it would be as if he slew the whole of humanity. And for this reason, it's gratifying to see the number of both Christian and Muslim religious leaders who have condemned the acts of disrespect and bigotry that produce the anti-Muslim cartoons and videos and the desecrations and destruction of mosques. It's gratifying also to see the Muslim leadership in our country that has called press conferences, issued statements, and sent letters to their co-believers to condemn violence against the innocent in some foreign countries. Now, often our approach to controverted social issues is very similar. For example, last week, Dr. Ekmeluddin Ihsanoğlu, the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference in New York to address the United Nations, said in an interview with the press, here's what he said: "Freedom of speech is one thing, but one should not use that freedom to offend others or advocate hate speech or provoke people to violence." He went on, "The right of demonstration should not be used to kill people or put fire to buildings or to offend others by burning flags. So we should not abuse the freedom of demonstration, and we should not abuse the freedom of others." Let's compare this view with that of Pope Benedict XVI, who, referring to the Danish cartoon controversy in 2006, he insisted, and I'm quoting him, "To foster peace and understanding between peoples, it's necessary and urgent that religions and their symbols be respected. This implies," he went on, "that believers not be the object of provocations that wound their lives and religious sentiments." And he held that intolerance and violence can never be justified as responses to offenses, as they are not compatible responses with the sacred principles of religion. Now, had I not identified the two religious leaders beforehand, it would have been difficult to know which one was a prominent Muslim spokesman and which one was a preeminent Christian leader. They're saying almost the very same point of view. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I'm from St. Louis. So I've been following somewhat closely the burning, twice, of the mosque in Joplin, Missouri. I think it is in microcosm an example of what is involved in living our faith together. In July of this year, the mosque that served the small community of about 50 Muslim families in the Joplin area was burned, with the roof and a wall damaged. It was declared arson by law enforcement officials. Then, a month later, during the holy fasting month of Ramadan, the mosque was burned again, this time to the ground. Once again, the police investigated, and once again, the cause was determined to be arson. Imam Lahmuddin of Joplin told the press, he said, "This will not stop us from worshiping God. we will find another place to do it. But this is not the end of the story. The Interfaith Alliance of St. Louis quickly condemned the arson, and in less than 2 weeks, over $400,000 was collected, most of it locally. Dr. Ghazala Hayat of the Islamic Foundation of Greater St. Louis said, "We are really heartened by the response of non-Muslims in the city to raise money so quickly to build up the mosque again." The Interfaith Alliance is now cooperating with St. Louis CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, on an educational campaign, distributing booklets and videos to explain the teachings of Islam, introducing Muslims to church and synagogue groups, and they're pursuing an outreach to local police departments to increase understanding and strengthen communications bonds. Now, my point is that in the world we live in, there will always be those driven by hatred and prone to violence, as well as those who have integrated the faith values that we, Muslims and Christians, as well as Jews, have inherited from our father Abraham into an obedient response to God. Jesus depicted the situation very well, describing our world as a field in which the wheat and the weeds are all growing mixed together and will stay that way until the future day of harvest arrives. So too in our American society. At the same time, some are trying to build harmony and peace and understanding. Others are trying to destroy those same values. I think it will happen that those who are more firmly committed to their path, whether it be harmony and unity or animosity and hatred, they will be the ones who have the greater influence on the course of history. And I think it's also worth our remembering that this combination of the hate-filled and the neighborly, living in the same civilization and culture, is not unique to American society. The same is true elsewhere in the world. We have all watched the television coverage of the protesters storming American embassies and consulates in the Middle East. But that's not the whole story. I hope that we've also watched the much larger crowds of bearded men and hijab-covered women in Benghazi, marching with homemade signs that read, "America, we're sorry, this is not Islamic behavior." Another sign I saw was, "Thugs and killers don't represent Islam." Another one, "Chris Stevens was a friend to Libyans." Some years ago, I was living in Indonesia when the social disruption that followed upon the fall of the dictatorial Suharto regime took on a religious element in which Christians and Muslims were, in several places, pitted against one another. At Christmas time that year, bomb threats were issued against Christian churches in an effort to disrupt worship services. In response, the youth wing of the Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Muslim organization in the country, publicly committed itself to protecting the churches. On Christmas Eve, more than 1,000 of these young Muslims swept the churches for bombs and then formed a cordon around the churches to permit safe access for worshipers during midnight mass. As it happened, a young Muslim named Rianto was among the volunteers checking the churches. Rianto was 26 years old, the father of 2, and he worked as a stock clerk in a supermarket. In one of the churches, he found a bomb under a pew in a plastic shopping bag and gingerly carried it out of the church all the way to the edge of the parking lot, where the bomb exploded in his hands, killing him instantly. Rianto was the only bombing victim in Indonesia that Christmas. This young man, with only a junior high school education, but formed by the teachings of his Islamic faith, is remembered by the Christian community in Indonesia as one of their heroes who gave his life for them. He was a true son of Abraham. The connection between hospitality and building the foundations of society reminds me of an interview Pope Benedict gave a few weeks ago. On his way to Lebanon on September 14th, the Pope took some questions from reporters. One question was, what did he think of the Arab Spring? In reply, the Pope affirmed that the Arab Spring, here I'm quoting him, was a positive thing, a desire for greater democracy, greater freedom, greater cooperation, and a revived Arab identity. And then he went on. The renewed Arab identity implies also a renewal of the centuries-old, millennia-old coexistence of Christians and Muslims who together, in mutual tolerance of majority and minority, built these lands and cannot do other than live side by side. This is one of the points that Dr. Bedawi was making in his talk this morning. So the Pope is enunciating an intriguing view of history, one too often overlooked by partisan historians, of Muslims and Christians in the Middle East together building their lands in mutual tolerance as majority and minority. We often forget the disruptions and the conflicts are the exception, separated by long periods of peaceful living together. Now, these hopes of the Pope for a mutually enriching coexistence of Christians and Muslims living together in mutual tolerance, building the country side by side, do not only apply to countries of the Arab Spring. They are equally needed in the American context. There is even a sense in which Muslims and Christians today must see their goal as going beyond peaceful coexistence to the more ambitious vision of seeing one another as partners united in a God-given mission in our country. There is a specific contribution they can make together as Christians and Muslims. On first hearing, people might be surprised or even shocked to hear of a common mission of Muslims and Christians in our nation. And yet this concept of a Muslim-Christian partnership is not a new one. You might remember how in the statement of the Second Vatican Council, the Bishop Sevilla was talking about at an opening session. You might remember in the document Nostra Aetate, there's the passage on the relationship of the Catholic Church to Muslims. So after mentioning the theological and social reasons why Christians should have esteem for Muslims, this esteem is a very interesting word, isn't it? It's even stronger than respect, because esteem means you're seeing what the others have that is good and admiring for what they have. You know, esteem is a very strong term. Anyhow, Christians should have esteem for Muslims, according to Second Vatican Council. But the document concludes with advice for the two communities of faith. So what is that advice? Acknowledging that down through the centuries, there have been many conflicts between Christians and Muslims. The document continues, or declares, and I quote it, "We urge all to move beyond the past, to work together for the good of all, for peace, social justice, moral values, and freedom." In this official document of the Catholic Church, the Council envisions nothing less than this shared mission in our world for Muslims and Christians. It's a partnership in which the two communities should work together for the common good in 4 key areas of modern life: to build peace, to establish justice in our societies, to defend moral values, and to promote true human freedom. Well, from the Muslim side, even earlier than the Second Vatican Council, some Muslims were already calling for Muslim-Christian unity in order to bring the values of faith into modern life. For example, Sayyid Nursi, who was probably the most influential Muslim thinker in Turkey in the 20th century, he foresaw pious Muslims cooperating with the good Christians to oppose aggressive atheism and destructive trends in society. And he encouraged both communities to work together to overcome the common problems of ignorance, poverty, and disunity. In his day, he was certainly thinking of the growth of aggressive communist regimes, but referring as well to problems of destructive and self-destructive tendencies and behavior in modern societies that are still present in our world today. But there's even a more basic reason for our partnership. For why do we exist, Muslims and Christians, except to bear witness to the one true God who made all things, who is merciful and compassionate, who is love itself, and who will one day judge every individual according to their deeds. And yet today, this truth is not self-evident to all in our society. There are many who say, "What God?" or "Who needs a God?" or "I'm an agnostic. I can't get involved in this old-time religious stuff. Religion only breeds fanatics." However, in what is shaping up to be the great debate of our day, I believe that the followers of Islam and Christianity may well find themselves in the same camp. In The Grand Design, the latest book by the prominent scientist Stephen Hawking, the author makes some startling claims about the universe. He says that given the operations of quantum physics and the law of gravity, the universe can and did create itself without the need for, and I quote him, intervention of some supernatural being or God. He holds that the laws of nature, and I quote him again, determine both the future and the past, and do not permit temporary suspension by a divine being in the form of miracles or answers to prayers. He further affirms, and I quote him again, he says, "It seems like we are no more than biological machines, and that free will is just an illusion caused by our failure to understand the complex interaction of physical laws." In short, no creation, no free will, and no one answering prayers. Now, Hawking is not the traditional village atheist working out some psychological authority problem by attacking the idea of a supreme being. He's a serious scientist attempting to describe our universe in accord with the results of mathematical formulae. However, the consequences that many could well derive from his theories and those of his fellow scientists are that humans are simply cogs in a godless, soulless machine that is proceeding inexorably from the last Big Bang towards the next far-off Big Crunch, to be followed anew by a subsequent Big Bang. Well, as more and more people in our societies abandon religion and belief in God as ideas incompatible with science, Muslims and Christians must recognize how much greater is what they share than the elements of dogma that divide them. The question that confronts every serious person today remains, is there anything outside the universe? Is there something or someone that is not scientifically measurable? Is there someone who is responsible for creating all this and to whom it is all ultimately answerable? To this, the great question of our age, Muslims and Christians affirm with surprising unanimity the existence of a good and loving God who has produced the world as a thing of beauty, who has destined humans for eternal happiness, and who has taught people to live according to ethical norms. This religious belief unites Christians and Muslims, as well as Jews, in a vision, our common Abrahamic heritage, of a very different type of universe, one that is, I believe, both warmer and more hopeful than the rather chilly mechanism of scientific theory. What we're talking about is not some battle between science and religion. Science is autonomous in its methodology and logic, and the old dictum still holds true: bad science begets bad dogma. Religious believers today, including Muslims and Christians, have much to learn from the advances in paleoanthropology, particle physics, the new cosmology, and other sciences on the frontiers of knowledge. The discovery of the Higgs boson is neither irrelevant nor threatening to our faith. Like the other new discoveries, we must try to integrate it into our awareness of the abiding mystery that we call God, Allah, who has accompanied our universe in the 13.7 billion years since the Big Bang, and the 2 to 4 million years that human ancestors have lived on this earth. Our religious images of a merciful creator who maintains all creation in being with a loving presence and benevolent power, who is guiding all things wisely toward a just consummation, these images complement and give meaning and direction to our scientific discoveries. Just as our religious understanding of God's presence and activity in the universe are enhanced by the advances of the natural sciences, so the scientific community needs to be enriched by the insights and convictions that arise from our faith in the God of Abraham. The contribution that we can make jointly to this discussion is crucial. But Muslims and Christians cannot give credible witness to this religious vision of life unless they are united in mutual respect and appreciation. If they feel they must fight out every disagreement and seek to dominate the other economically, politically, and intellectually, their jointly held profession of reality as being the product of a merciful and compassionate God will be dismissed as belligerent ideology that human society is better off without. In other words, in working to build harmony between the two communities, our very credibility is at stake. The message that we see as giving direction to our lives can only respond to the spiritual needs of the people of our time if it is a message of peace. This conviction that has motivated my work for the past 40 years has not dimmed with time, but is, if anything, stronger today than before. I can only believe in a God whose love and mercy and forgiveness are not limited to any group of people or any exclusive community of believers. Already in the Quran, it is stated that the closest community in friendship to the Muslims is those who say we are Christians. If that was the case in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, can it not be the case again today? In this connection, I want to tell you one final story, one that happened over 20 years ago, but has stayed in my mind all these years. In 1990, while I was working in the Vatican in charge of the Office for Relations with Muslims, I made a trip to China to make contact with the Muslim communities there. Among the places I visited was Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, the capital of Xinjiang province in the northwest corner of China. You probably know that that area used to be mainly Muslims, but in recent decades has seen much non-Muslim immigration from other parts of China. During the Cultural Revolution, many of those accused of bourgeois tendencies were exiled to re-education camps in the area. Well, anyway, one day, after visiting the main mosque in Urumqi, I was sitting in the mosque garden talking to a group of elderly Muslim men. We were chatting about various things when one of the men asked me, "Do you believe in God?" I said, "Yes, I do." And another one asked, "How many gods?" And I said, just the one God. And then somebody else said, "Well, then you're a Muslim." And I said, "No, actually, I'm a Christian." Well, that stopped them. "Christian? What is that?" Nobody in the group had ever heard of Christians. Well, I was surprised and a little humbled that there was a place in the world that no one had even heard of Christians. But then one old man who was better informed than the rest, he spoke up. He said, "I've heard of the Christian religion." He said, "It's a sect of Islam." Like us, Christians worship the one God. And like us, they're waiting to be judged by God according to their deeds. But whereas we Muslims follow the Prophet Muhammad, they follow the Prophet Jesus. So Muslims and Christians are sister communities. And the others all nodded and took in the information. Oh, so that's what Christians are. Well, it's an instructive exercise to see ourselves through the eyes of another, to see how we're regarded by others. And I have to admit that this old Uyghur Muslim was not too far off the mark in his evaluation. One God, judged according to our deeds, following Jesus, sister communities. Is that the way others see us? Is that the way that those who have no faith in God look upon us, Muslims and Christians, sister communities? Is that the way our own adherents look upon one another and regard one another? I think many people don't see us that way and that we still have much work ahead of us. Naturally, there are matters on which we disagree, and we can't ignore them or sweep them away. When I teach Christian theology and Islamic theology faculties in Turkey or Iran or Indonesia, I focus on trying to delineate for my students the points of convergence and divergence between our faiths, for both are important. If we forget those key elements of faith that we hold in common, we lose sight of the partnership to which God calls us. If we downplay those elements of our faith that are unique to each religion, we lose sight of the distinctiveness of our call, of the special message that we must proclaim to the world. Muslims must glory in the prophethood of Muhammad and the Quranic message that he brought, just as Christians must glory in the cross of Jesus Christ and our faith in what God has accomplished in him for all humankind. But this profession of faith need not be grounds for enmity. Already in 1076, Pope Gregory VII wrote to An-Nasr, the king of Bijaya in modern-day Algeria. He wrote the following words. He said, "God, Almighty God, who desires that all people shall be saved and that none shall perish, approves nothing in us more highly than this, that after loving God, a person should love his fellow man and do nothing to him that he would not want others to do to himself. This affection, we and you," that is, Christians and Muslims, "owe to each other in a more particular way than to others, because we worship and confess the same God, though in diverse ways, and daily praise and adore him as the creator and ruler of this world. For God knows truly that we desire your prosperity and your honor, both in this life and in the life to come. And God knows how earnestly we pray, both with our lips and with our heart, that God himself, after a long journey in this life, may lead you into the bosom of the most holy patriarch, Abraham. May God lead, in other words, may God lead you forward until you reach the bosom of Abraham, the one whose faith unites us in the first place. This is the attitude we should have toward one another. Even though we disagree on various parts of doctrine, this must not make us enemies. I believe that even in our disagreements, we can trust that God, who knows that each of our communities is wholly sincere in our faith. In this context, I often remember the words of the Quran. To God you are all returning. At that time you will be informed about those issues, about those things over which you disagreed. We don't have to fight out these issues here and now, because eventually, and this is my deepest hope, the truth will become clear to us all. Thank you.